The McDonnell Douglas, later Boeing, F-15 Eagle is their saying. Their slogan used to go, "Not a pound for air to ground." Hi, this is Misha, and today we're going to talk about how the Israeli Air Force turned the whole notion of the Eagle on its head. Designed as an air superiority fighter, they turned it into a strike aircraft. And typically when you try to make a aircraft or anything into something it's not intended for, it's adequate at best. Not so with the Eagle. Ended up being one of the best in the world. So we've got two models here from the Israeli Air Force. This is an F-15B Baz, which is basically Hebrew for eagle. That's the original style. And this is the F-15I Raham, which is thunder. And this is basically an Israeli variant of the F-15E Strike Eagle. But honestly, without Israel, the Strike Eagle may not have happened. It's an interesting story. So, with no further ado. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the F-15 itself. I've done that in past videos and can do it again if we need to. But we're just going to talk about how Israel turned it into a multi-role aircraft. Going all the way back to 1974, the Israeli Defense Force, the Israeli Air Force, set up a team to kind of pick a new air superiority fighter. This was to combat anything that the Arab states could possibly throw against them. And they're namely thinking of like the MiG-25, the MiG-23, and yeah, of course, the MiG-21. Also, there are some Mirages and other French aircraft around. So they need something they can go against. And so they go to the USA, and they look at the F-14 and the F-15, and it was unanimous. They selected the F-15 after trying it out, and their reasons are quite solid. So, what's known as Peace Fox begins, and it would allow for 25 USAF surplus, U.S. Air Force surplus, early F-15s that go back to the factory to be refurbished to be supplied to Israel. The pilots would begin training on them in mid-76, and the first two would land in December, with two more in early 77. And these first four aircraft, we had two A single-seaters and two B twin-seaters. They were really for testing and evaluation, and Israel definitely did that. In fact, they gave McDonnell Douglas a suggestion list about a mile long of things to change, and actually were very influential in the F-15 CDs, which started to go into production in 78, 79. So really did help kind of push this forward. Now they would get those first four aircraft, and then they would obtain 19 more A's and 2 more B's. Now the B's were designed to be two-seat trainers. However, they were fully combat capable, but the idea was trainer. The A, the single-seater, was meant to be the air superiority fighter. But Israel noticed something from the very get-go. Even though they said not a pound for air to ground, these were actually given a very minimal ability to carry gravity bombs, iron bombs, unguided bombs. So we're looking like Mark 82s, Mark 83s, and the similar. They were interested in this, but it would have to wait. So for the first few years, like Operation Oprah in 1981, the Lebanon War, yeah, these were escort fighters for the F-16s and air superiority, and they downed a number of MiGs. But in 1983, things started to change. And that kind of plan that had been in the back of their mind to turn these into a multi-role fighter started to look more feasible. Jumping back to 1981, Israel would start to receive the first of the F-15Cs and Ds. They would get 9 of the Cs and 6 of the Ds between 81 and 82, and this would be supplemented by another 9 Cs and 2 more Ds around 84, 85. Basically, Peace Fox 2 allowed for 15 planes, and that was slightly expanded. And the CDs had some improvements, mainly correcting a lot of flaws, but they also had a lot more internal fuel. That was important. And in 83, Israel received their first 2 KC-707 tankers, which meant that aerial refueling was a possibility. Now, Operation Oprah back in 81 had a very long range. There were F-16s doing the bombing with F-15s doing the escort. But that would just kind of be the beginning. In 1985, Israel would pull out of Lebanon after being an occupying force for a while. And this would lead to a program that summer to kind of update their planes. The Ds would take advantage of that back seat so he could control weapons using new installed systems. And they would actually add, at least to some of their Ds, conformal fuel tanks. And that was important, and you'll see why in just a minute. The Cs, too, were updated to multi-role. And actually, this model came with a centerline tank, but I happened to find a centerline rack from a F-105 that has 6, I think they're Mark 82, they might be Mark 83 bombs, but that goes to show you that some of the Cs were equipped with the iron bombs, and some of the Ds could too, and they would typically mount them under the fuselage, reserving the wings for their fuel tanks if they didn't have the conformal tanks. They would do a number of updates to make them multi-role capable. And right after this kind of program was going, and right after they received the last of their Cs and Ds, there would be a very historic, sometimes infamous and condemned, other times applauded and affirmed operation known as Operation Wooden Leg. Now, this model of an F-15B BAZ isn't exactly correct, but to be fair, the difference between a B and a D, or an A and a C, is mostly internal. By the way, they called their C's and D's the AKEF, A-K-E-F, AKEF buzzard. Israel usually gives different names all the time. So BAZ, AKEF, AKIF. And that mission would be conducted on October 1st, 1985. It was in response to killing of 3 Israeli citizens back in September of that year by the PLO. Israel claimed these were PLO terrorists and that these were innocent civilians vacationing off the coast of Cyprus. The PLO responded saying they were not civilians, they were spies. Take it as you will. Either way, they set out to bomb the crap out of the PLO headquarters. And this was the first time the F-15 was ever used as a striker. The main force would be 8 aircraft, and they would fly together for a while, then they would split up into 2 flights or 2 little wings, 4 each. And we would have 6 F-15Ds that had been modified with conformal fuel tanks, and they had 2 GBU-15 guided glide bombs. These were relatively low altitude but precision munitions, and they had to update the F-15 quite a bit to make them work because they had to mount a pod. And that's actually why the conformal fuel tanks were important. The pod was in the center line, and the wings, which only have 1 hard point each, held the GBU-15s meaning there was no place to put fuel tanks, so they had to use the conformal tanks. These also had a 20mm cannon, just in case. And to protect these, they outfitted 4 F-15Cs. Now these would carry 6 500-pound Mark 82 bombs. That's kind of what I was going to simulate with this model. It's not exact, but gives you the idea. And that took up their center line point, but the wing points were still there for fuel. And these would also carry AIM-7 Sparrows to protect the fleet, and they would carry AIM-9 Sidewinders for close-range defense of themselves. Now there were 4, however only 2 would go the distance. The other 2 were spares, and they would turn away at the first refueling point. So 10 planes took off, and 8 made it over and hit the PLO base, destroying up to 90% of it, killing at least 60, some sources say as many as 100, and injuring nearly that many. This was roundly condemned by the Middle East and by most in the UN and even the USA. But it was the first time the F-15 was used to attack a ground target, and it put Israel's neighbors and enemies on notice. And it also, frankly, got the USA to take notice, which kind of leads to the Strike Eagle. Just to wrap things up, the ABs that Israel had, they were all secondhand, refurbished U.S. Air Force. The CDs they received were new. There would be another batch in 1992 that they received. And it's interesting because they would get 14 surplus, 13 of them being A models and 1 being a B model. These were from Louisiana. These were Israel's reward for staying out of the first Gulf War. But they would also receive 5 more F-15Ds that were new production from McDonnell Douglas, soon to be Boeing. And what's interesting about these, they're very late F-15Ds. Now, main production of the CD had ended around 1985, 1986, but they were transitioning over to making the F-15E, which started around 1987. So these were actually F-15E type airframes, but finished out to an F-15D standard. And this is really when we see Israel embracing the 2-seat version, and the C models and A models were kind of taking a back seat role because you're not giving up much. Has still a great top speed, great altitude. The D model, the B model can still carry air-to-air weapons, but now you have 2 people in the cockpit, and it's just handy. But the Gulf War got Israel thinking, and the success of various operations showed the validity, and that's where we come to our next aircraft and story. The F-15 RAM, or as McDonnell Douglas, later Boeing, called it, the F-15I. I'll let you guess what I stands for. It's interesting, Israel was the first to turn the F-15 Eagle into a strike aircraft and had more success in the late 80s and in the early and mid-90s with them. And this spurred McDonnell Douglas on to develop the F-15E Strike Eagle. So they kind of built off of each other. I should say that the F-15E was on the drawing boards around the same time, but the first prototype did not fly for about a year after the Operation Wooden Leg, and would not go into full production and service for 2 to 3 years. Now, in the beginning, the Strike Eagle was not authorized for export. Now, there was a downgraded version known as the F-15S that was used by Saudi Arabia and others. And Israel stayed out of the Gulf War, at least the way the Americans wanted. But it got them really concerned about fast-moving targets, ground targets like the Iraqi Scud missiles, and of course newer jets. So they really started looking at a new strike aircraft. They looked at the F-111, which is interesting. They rejected it because of older technology. It had no self-defense capabilities, and maintenance cost on any swing wing in a desert is going to be pretty damn high. They also looked at the F-16, very cost-effective, but didn't really have the capabilities that they were looking for. And even the F-18D just wasn't quite what they wanted. Maybe if the Super Hornet had been out at that time, that would have done it, but who knows. They really liked the Strike Eagle. Just a couple of problems. It wasn't authorized for sale until late 1993, and it cost 3 times as much per plane compared with an F-16 of similar setup. Now, originally they wanted to buy 50, 25 each to equip 2 new strike squadrons. In the early 80s, Israel operated only 1 squadron of Eagles, Bazes, and then a second squadron came in 1985. And the A-Bs were used as interceptors, fighters, and the CDs could be used as that or multi-role attack aircraft, strike aircraft. So they were hoping to have 2 more squadrons of multi-role strike aircraft, but because of the cost, compromises had to be made. In January of 1994, an initial deal was struck for 21, with an option for 4 more. Now the plum was that they would end up buying more F-16s, which would ultimately become the F-15I Sufa, and they would buy up to 100 of those. They would also update the older F-15s in service with the BAZ 2000 program we'll talk about in a minute. By May of 94, they would go ahead and exercise the option for 4 more, bringing the total to 25. This would be enough to equip a 1 full squadron with spares. And McDonnell Douglas, about to become Boeing, would specially design the F-15I for Israel. And it would also be built with some components supplied by or even installed by Israel. It was designed for long range, all weather, no matter what was going on, missions, and low flying, and to have a long range and heavy payload. In fact, it could carry about 4.5 tons of fuel. It had internal tanks, it had conformal tanks as standard, it had optional external tanks. And it could carry up to 11 tons of weapons, mainly focusing on guided weapons, because that's where the Ds, where they were able to get them to use some guided weapons, but they wanted to be able to use the latest and greatest payways, JDAMs, so on and so forth, plus have the latest communication systems, GPS, sat-nav. In fact, if you look on this model, you can kind of see a funny little thing in the back here. That's the sat-nav antenna. And it was of Israeli design, so pretty unique to these. At any rate, the first prototype flew in September of 1997, and then in November of that year, the first plane was officially handed over to the IDF, to the Israeli Air Force, and pilots began training. And the first 2 planes, flying directly from Boeing to Israel with just, stopovers for fuel, landed in January of 1998, and the order would be completed the following June 1999. Interestingly, it would not have to wait long to go into combat. The F-15Is were first used to strike targets in Lebanon in early 1999, alongside others. And while that would be the only order, they have continued to keep these up to date and in service, as they have with the older aircraft as well. And these are definitely ready for the 21st century as much as they can make them. While we talk about the BAZ 2000 program, let's take the F-15B off the stand and show you the underside here. Like I said, I put the bombs on. It's pretty appropriate. I just want to do something a little different. I think I have got my fuel tank over here somewhere. Yeah, it just came with a big centerline tank there. It does have the wing tanks, just having a little fun. But when these were fielded, they were using the AIM 9 9L Sidewinder, and the Sparrow, the AIM-7 missile. And that pretty much was what they went with, plus the iron bombs. In the 90s, they were updated, at least the D models, to use the Popeye missile, one that we saw on the F-4 Kernas, the 2000. And they were updated to use the AIM-120 AMRAAM, and eventually also the Python 4, which was an off-bore sight missile similar to America's AIM-9X, but actually something in service much earlier. So kind of ahead of the game there. And they even had a helmet and everything for it. And so the program began in 1995 and would last through 2005. And it was basically hand refitting 50 of the lowest flight hour planes. About 75 ABCDs were in the Israeli military over the years. They took the 50 that had the most life left in them, and they really rebuilt them. They gave them a new standardized cockpit. They even got that weird R2-D2 looking antenna mount behind the canopy, at least eventually they would. Like I said, they had new access to weapons, typical refurbishment, new computers, and it was a pretty expensive program, but it was a way to get more life out of these. By this point, a lot of the older A's and B's are either returning vehicles or retired out, though. So mostly C's and D's. I actually looked, and it doesn't seem like Hobbymaster has done an Israeli C or D. If I'm wrong, please let me know. That'd be pretty neat. But they were still very much in service with 2 squadrons into the 21st century. And actually, in 2016, the U.S. would donate 8 F-15Ds that were U.S. surplus, about to be sent to the scrapyard to Israel. They gladly took them and essentially reworked them into something very close to the F-15I. Not quite, but close. Bringing the total up to about 58 in service, give or take any kind of losses. But these still primarily operated as air defense with secondary strike roles. And steps have been taken to keep these in service into the 2030s at the very least, meaning that they're definitely getting their money's worth out of them. And I will take the F-15I, where I am, off the stand. As you can see, I can't, but you can. This is in the newer desert camo on top, and then kind of the low-vis gray on bottom. And there's a lot going on. Now, this model did not come with side wing tanks, because it has the conformal tanks. It did come with the centerline tank, but it also came with the bomb to put there. And I thought we would deck this guy out. And when these were first delivered, they were using the AIM-9L. That was pretty quickly replaced in service with the Python 4. And the AIM-7 was quickly replaced in favor of the AIM-120 AMRAAM. Newer weapons. Sometimes they would carry unguided, as you can see here. Sometimes they would carry guided munitions. And we have a lantern pod and targeting pod there, mounted under the intakes. And no, I have no idea if I have them on the right side or not. I just kind of had to guess. Some Strike Eagles actually have 3 pods under them. This one just came with 2. That's kind of how they're rolling. Neat model, and certainly loaded down. You can see the conformal tanks kind of bulging there. Even without external tanks, these things would have quite the good range, and they're still capable of hitting about Mach 2.5 at altitude. Certainly Mach 2 even loaded down. And a max altitude of about 60,000 feet. A very capable aircraft, and unlike that F-111, it has short range and medium range defensive missiles and even a 20mm cannon if need be. So after being in service for about 15 some odd years, in 2016, these two were given kind of a midlife update program, new avionics, an update to their computers, new displays, new compatibility, data encryption, all that fun stuff, updated radar. So they've even spiffed up their F-15Is today, which leads a lot of people to consider these the most advanced and most capable of the Strike Eagle family. And of course, along with their brethren. Getting these aircraft, especially the I's, let Israel finally retire the F-4 Phantom that had previously been their strike aircraft to some extent. And of course, they've been used in several missions and are still used today. No matter how you feel about the politics behind it, one thing is undeniable. The Israelis have really pushed the envelope with a lot of aircraft, including the F-15. They had some of the very first aerial victories with them. In fact, I think they had the very first one in 1979. And they've shot down 40, even some sources say 50, enemy jets using their F-15s. And their loss record is very good. In fact, they've really only lost them to accidents and other events, but I've had this B for a while. You've seen it maybe in a few past videos. It's just neat. But when Hobbymaster announced this I last year, I immediately put one on pre-order. I was kind of wanting another Strike Eagle anyway, and this one's a pretty unique variant. And Hobbymaster does a very good job with their F-15s. They're very heavy and pretty much all metal. The only plastic may be part of the tail, of course the tip of the nose and the ordnance, but the main body is all a chunk of metal. And they do give you a big amount of ordnance for the Strike Eagles especially, and you usually get a couple of display options. Not a ton, but more than one. I don't know. We haven't had a lot of new aircraft recently. Last time I showed you an old World War II plane from Corgi. So this time we go modern with Hobbymaster. And there's tons of history here. Good or bad, that's your own decision. Like I said, the politics of it, I don't talk about that because not the point. This is to talk about engineering and history and models and just have fun and relax. That's all it is. Oh, one thing I should point out, the A's and B's, and I believe the C's and D's as well, have a movable air brake back here. The E's do not. Just something I'd mention. Of course, they have gear up or down, and they have canopy up, open or closed, and pilots in or out. You know the deal, I'm sure, by now with Hobbymaster. But, yeah, the Israeli F-15. In the past, I did a big look at the Israeli F-16, so it only seemed honest to do a video on the 15. So let me know what you think. And I probably will do another video showing the A and talking more about the air-to-air, the air superiority role, because there was enough to talk about here just on the air-to-surface. In the 21st century, these have been used to do things like hit Syrian reactors and hit Hezbollah camps, and yeah, do a bunch of stuff. One thing you say, it's a very capable aircraft, so its success rating is very, very high. But anyway, I appreciate you hanging out today. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.